So the long-awaited balance patch has finally come, and for the first time since Path of Fire has launched, ArenaNet directly nerfed Scourge. Not bug fix nerfed, actually nerfed. And they've also directly nerfed a bunch of other things, in addition to totally reworking Mesmers and a whole bunch of other stuff. As usual, I'm primarily just going to talk about what this all means for Necromancers. I will go over what some of the changes mean for the other classes, but it'll be in much more abstract. To start, I'll start with Necros. This patch dealt almost exclusively with Scourge. It did not touch Reaper, and it did not touch Core Necro to any large degree. The changes, the big one is a half-second arming of a Shade skill when used. It's important to note, Shade skills are still instant cast. You don't have to cast them. You cannot interrupt a Shade cast. But when you drop a Shade, the enemy player will see a red circle appear with this outward expanding red, as you see in the video right there, ground icon. And it's pretty fast, but it does provide a noticeable tell. And what's also nice about this is this only shows up for the enemy team, which means you're not cluttering your allied team's screen with these giant red circles. Only the people that can actually be hurt by the red circles will be seeing these things. But again, it's basically just a half-second arming delay, is what I would phrase it as, that allows for some reactive play. And this is actually pretty important, and it's something that a lot of people have been asking for, going back to basically the Path of Fire beta, which is some sort of a tell for the Shades to allow reactive play. Because before it was instant, like, you couldn't see in any way when a Shade skill was being activated. You basically had to anticipate them. And given how enormously potent Shade skills are and how often they came out, that just wasn't something that you could realistically handle at all. So this half-second arming delay is definitely a good change. I definitely support it. It is important to note that this arming delay does affect the altruistic portions of Shade skills. So for instance, your barrier application on Sand Cascade is affected by this arming delay. Also, the barrier on your F5 is also affected by it, in addition to the Condi Cleanse on F2. Speaking of F2, Nefarious Favor, which is again your F2, no longer cleanses 2 conditions. It now only converts 1 condition into a boon. Its cooldown has also been increased. So that's a pretty heavy nerf there. And in addition to this, Path of Corruption, which is the trait in Curses that adds 2 boon corrupts to your second Shroud skill, has been changed so that it only converts 1 boon when used with the Scourge Profession. And that's actually really significant, because this is the first time in the game where a trait's functionality changes based on what other trait lines you have equipped. So this is something new. Perhaps in the future we might see more traits take into account what elite spec is being used with them, which could certainly add some interesting room for balancing, because it means traits that are not a problem on some builds can be balanced without causing them to be broken on other builds. So that could be interesting. Although this also adds just a whole nother layer of complexity to build crafting, because you now have to take into account traits that function differently depending on what other trait lines you have. So that's something that hopefully they won't be doing too often. But in the case of Path of Corruption, it is definitely a good thing, because having those 2 boon corrupts on the massive radius of Scourge's Shades was just too much, particularly given how easily it was accessed and how low the cooldown it was. So that was a good change. Unending Corruption just had a bug fix. The tooltip for Manifest Shade now properly displays Unending Corruption, so no actual mechanical change there. Another one that I've been seeing causing some confusion on the forums with people understanding what the change did. Sand Swell, that is your portal skill, your punishment portal skill, The patch notes say, increase the speed of the portal's formation once the skill has been cast, and alter the effect so it does not get called when in high-density situations. There has been some confusion as to what this means. What it does is it does not actually change how the skill works. Your skill does not cast faster, and your portal does not come out faster. What it means is the visual effect for the Sandswell portal appears faster when you complete your cast. And the not getting called in high-density situations, what that means is in a situation with a lot of visual effects on the screen, say a World v. World Zerg, the game engine will not cull it, which basically means that the game engine in high-density situations, like a World v. World Zerg, will stop rendering visual effects in order to keep your computer from choking and so you can maintain some semblance of visibility. So what they've done is they made it so Sandswell will always be visible and it will appear faster when cast. This doesn't benefit the Scourge casting him at all, but it does benefit the teammates of the Scourge because it means they can identify that the Scourge has used that portal and that portal is available for them to use faster. So that's basically makes it a little easier for allies to take advantage of your portal instead of portal just being this selfish teleport thing. Moving on, a few more. There's a feed from corruption change. They just added alacrity to the feed from corruption conversion table. This is because alacrity is now a boon. It is not an effect like it was before, which means it is affected by all traits that affect boons. And since the feed from corruption Grandmaster and Scourge gives you boons when you corrupt them, it basically says you now get alacrity if you corrupt alacrity. This isn't really useful. About the only time you're going to be corrupting alacrity is if you're fighting a Chronomancer, which just there aren't that many of them these days. So not very useful. And of course feed from corruption, even with this change, is definitely not going to see play compared to the overwhelming monster that is Sansavant in the Scourge Grandmaster tier. They fixed the bug with Abrasive Grit, which was the Adept tier trait on Scourge, where they would cleanse a condition and gain might when granting a barrier. Previously it was bugged, so that if you granted a barrier to someone that already had a barrier, the trait would not activate. They made it so it will always activate even if the person you're granting the barrier to already has one, so definitely a buff for more support-oriented Scourges. Again, it doesn't really matter for PvP, because Scourges don't run that trait, but if you felt like running that trait, it is functional now. The only other change to Scourge was punishment skills, where they took the duration of the torment applied by the boon conversion from punishment skills and reduced it to 8 seconds, down from 10, and they reduced the cripple duration from 3 to 2. This concerns me, because I see where they were going with this. They're obviously trying to bring Scourge down in PvP and World v. World, where it is a very dominant class, and that is something that definitely needed to be brought down. But the fact that they decided to touch the torment and cripple durations on the punishment skill conversions kind of tells me that they don't know exactly where Scourge's damage comes from, because the punishment skills do not comprise much at all of Scourge's damage output. Punishment skills are very low radius, with the exception of Ghastly Breach, and they only activate one conversion, and you just don't use them to attack someone. Like, you don't use Sandswell to attack someone. You don't use Trail of Anguish to attack someone. You use them for their primary functions, which was portaling for the former and stun breaking and getting away for the latter. Which means realistically they're not comprising much at all of Scourge's offense, so this change, this nerf to the torment applied by boon conversions caused by punishment skills, and the reduction of the cripple duration applied, it means nothing. Like, they could have nerfed the torment duration applied by punishment skills down to 1 second, and they could have nerfed the cripple down to 1 second, and it wouldn't have mattered at all. Like, it's just a meaningless change that just misses the point, as far as I'm concerned. But oh well, I guess there is a little bit less cripple and a little bit less torment, but Scourge can still easily maintain 100% cripple uptime if it wants. And that sums up the changes to Scourge specifically. There was one general change, which is Vampiric Presence. It now has a half-second ICD, but it's, as they put it, the power contribution from the Necromancer to the damage portion of the trait has been increased by 1,200%. That's a big number. Which, granted, how bad the power scaling was before isn't actually as huge as it would sound on the patch notes. The healing power contribution has also been increased, but only by 560%. This change I don't quite understand. Their explanation was is they wanted to make it more competitive with other buffs, and it is certainly much harder hitting per instance of damage, since before you get like 30 to 40 damage per strike, whereas now it's hitting on the Demolisher build I was running, it was generally hitting for almost 200 damage in Shroud, and then there's like 100 damage out of Shroud, if I remember correctly. So it is doing more damage. Of course, since it has an ICD now, it means skills that have a lot of small attacks, like Axe 2, Greatsword 3, Soul Spiral, and Reaper's Shroud, they will not get as much from this trait compared to its previous version. Also, since they only scaled the healing power by 560%, this trait is significantly worse in terms of sustain because of the ICD. So you actually get less healing out of this trait now than you did before the buff, although you probably get more damage, at least in a single target situation. It is, however, much less useful of a trait in a cleave situation, because if you're hitting multiple targets, the ICD is shared among all targets, so you will not be getting life leeches from every single thing you hit anymore. Although I do suppose that the insane power scaling does mean it is a better aura for your allies. But as far as its value to the Necromancer, it is much less than what it was. Which makes me sad. Especially since life leeches is very important to Reaper sustain in the current meta, since we can no longer use our Shroud defensively. However, in practice, while I do feel that this was a nerf, it is not so big of a nerf that you really notice it much. There was only a few cases where I really felt like I was getting a huge difference from previous performance, and those were all in situations where I had lots of targets to cleave. Now, overall, what does it mean? So, first off, Scourge is still going to be meta. I will straight up say that. A lot of people are saying Scourge is dead. No, it is not dead. Curse's Scourge took a pretty nasty hit, though, with the change to Path of Corruption. So we will probably see a lot more blood magic versions of Scourge compared to Curse's Scourge, which used to be the most common form of Scourge. Which, you know, I guess is bringing Scourge a little closer to the ideal of a support that Arena originally sold it has, although the fact that they nerfed the amount of boons getting converted by the F2 kind of tells me that they might be giving up on the idea of Scourge as a support. So, yeah. But Scourge will still be meta. It is much easier to deal with, though, now. It is not the, oh, look, a Scourge came in, you're all dead now, that it was before the patch. So it is much more manageable. It still totally counters Reaper. I will say that Scourge has a lot of issues against Spellbreaker now. Spellbreaker is a lot harder to deal with as a Scourge than it was before the patch. And Thieves and Mesmers are a lot harder to deal with as a Scourge after this patch. So we shall see. But for the most part, I'm definitely predicting that Scourge will stay in the meta. Now, about the rest of the meta. To talk about that, we need to get into what happened to everyone else, and this is where it gets a little bit insane. So there was a massive number of changes to every class. But I'm going to, for the sake of brevity, just skim through these and touch on the important ones. Elementalists, they had a lot of miscellaneous buffs to Sword Weaver and some glyph changes. The glyph changes are basically useless for PvP, and I honestly don't think they even matter in PvE. The changes to Weaver, I actually did some duels against Traverse to test out the new Weaver changes. Weaver is definitely much improved from where it was before the patch. It is probably not going to be meta though, but it definitely can hit hard enough that it can actually kind of hurt people now instead of just like tickle them. So that's definitely an improvement there, but I don't think we will be seeing any Weavers in the meta anytime soon. Moving on to Engineer. They had a whole slew of changes for Engineer. Basically, what the gist of these are is mines caused by the dodge roll when traded in explosives now have an arming time. This is to cut down on the explosive version of Hollowsmith, which was doing crazy burst damage when they dodged, and I am glad they made this change. It was a very needed change. The rest of the changes basically sum up to they're messing with Scrapper to try and make it more tanky. Scrapper has barrier access now from adaptive armor rather than just a few % of damage reduction. The other big change is the Miner in Alchemy has been changed so that they no longer get a Condi Clear when using Elixir, and instead they just heal when they give themselves a boon. I presume this was done to make Alchemy a little more friendly for non-Elixir heavy builds, but it does also mean that heavy Elixir builds will have a little harder time with condition management, although it also opens up some other interesting sustain options via stacking lots of boon generations. Because again, the new miner that gives healing when gaining a boon has no ICD. A bunch of random changes to various skills that don't really matter much. A few changes to Scrapper to improve its defensive capabilities. I still don't think Scrapper will be meta just because Scourge is still in the meta. Scrapper's viability is entirely dependent on Scourge. I do want to call out one specific change, which is they now have a trait on NG called oh goodness, I'm totally blanking. Purity of Purpose, there we go. Sorry, I misplaced my notes. Which is very amusing. It's actually a very good trait. It's basically, if they cleanse a condition, they gain the boon, or they gain a boon depending on what condition was cleansed. Which is a very nice trait for builds that can use it. But I just wanted to call that particular one out because they named it Purity of Purpose, which is a long-standing meme in the in the engineer community because of a patch last year or so where they nerfed the block duration on Toolkit, and their stated reason for doing this was to preserve purity of purpose for the kit, which caused a great many memes on the NG sub-4. Moving on, Guardian, they had some changes to spirit weapons, which are meaningless. I don't think we'll be seeing spirit weapons in PvP at all, or in PvE. They did nerf a number of the tome skills and mantra skills. They're very slight nerfs to try and bring down Firebrand survivability capabilities. They're not huge though. Firebrand is still very much the Apex bunker build, but it is no longer as insane as it used to be. It's a little bit easier to, it's a little bit easier to kill now, so that is good. Although it is definitely not falling out of the meta. Mesmer, huge changes. They're reworking Phantasm. Phantasms are no longer count as a clone, but they do, and when you spawn a Phantasm, they cast one skill and then die and turn into a clone. Everything I say from here on out, take with a grain of salt, because since these changes to Mesmer are huge, like it's 2 pages of notes just for Mesmer. It will be a long time before we figure out exactly what in the Sam Hill Mesmer is going to be doing, because they completely redid how Mesmer functions with this patch. But basically, what me and Javerse were able to figure out after lots of testing it is Kandi Mirage is basically dead. So you don't have to worry about that monster anymore. Power versions of Mesmer are very much alive and kicking, possibly buffed. So watch out for all those Instagib spikes. You'll be seeing a lot more of those. Also, their downstate 3 skill can hit for 7k. Found that out the hard way. Just so if they spawn that Phantasm, which is what their downstate 3 skill does, is it spawns this Phantasm that pokes you in the back. If they spawn that Phantasm, kill it immediately before it hits you, because if it hits you, it's going to wreck you. Just FYI. One thing that I did notice on the new Phantasms that is kind of important is there's a Phantasm called, what is it? Where is it? Phantasmal Disenchanter. It's never been used on PvP builds in a long time. But it may get used maybe just because it's kind of insane after this patch. Me and Javerse were looking at it. If you use this utility skill, it spawns a Phantasm that throws a bouncing projectile that rips 5 boons and also hits you for damage. And if it hits a boonless foe, which wouldn't be surprising if you've got this bouncing projectile that rips 5 boons, it does power damage as high as Gravedigger. Like, it hits like a truck. Granted, that does require utility skill, so it probably won't make it onto high-end builds, but you may see some interesting gank builds for Mesmer using this, so watch out for that. Although it definitely will not be seeing tournament play because, again, they're blowing an entire utility skill to get that. But general thing for Mesmer, no more Kandi Mirage. We'll see lots of Power Mesmer. Whether Power Mesmer is actually going to be in the meta long term, I have no idea. Rangers, they had some reworks for their pet. It doesn't really matter. Most of it was just bug fixing and just changing various pet skills around in insignificant ways. There's no real meta change here. Druid's still going to be amazing. Sylvie's probably not so much. Revenant, they got some interesting changes. So they had a bunch of meaningless buffs to Renegade to try and make Renegade better. It's not going to bring Renegade into the meta, though. So, yeah, but Renegade's in a better spot. They also changed Shiro for Rev. So previously in Shiro, you had an upkeep skill that would pulse quickness. What this skill now does is it causes, when it's being upkept, all their strikes to deal extra strike damage instead of quickness. And they've instead had quickness added to phase traversal, which is their teleport. So this is, in general, less overall quickness, but they basically get free quickness when opening on someone, so they can be a little more bursty right off the bat without having to spend energy on upkeep. A lot of revs are bemoaning this. I played around with a rev, actually, and it's not too bad, particularly once you realize that the extra strikes caused by the upkeep skill count has, well, strikes, which means you get life leeches off them and you can proc stuff off them. And if you combine them with the life steals from the Shiro heal skill, you can actually get some pretty nasty additional burst. You can easily take 60 to 70% of someone's health just with Sword 4 with those two things. And I actually one-shot the Mesmer NPC in Heart of the Mists with that combo. So it's definitely a hard-hitting combo there. But not so much that Rev is going to be meta. It's probably more of a sideways change because, again, they did lose the quickness access, which was a pretty big thing for them. So it's a wash. I don't think it's all the doom and gloom that the Revenant subform is spouting right now, though. Moving on, Thief. They had a bunch of PvE-only changes for raids and stuff. They basically have special stolen skills for raids just to make them more useful in raids. Deadeye got some damage bonuses in PvE only. These don't affect PvP, so don't worry about that. And they added Alacrity to Consume Plasma, which is the skill they steal from Mesmer. A lot of people are annoyed by this because Consume Plasma has been buffed several times already, and it's arguably the most overpowered of Thief's steal skills, considering it gives them basically every boon in the game for a good duration. But honestly, well, yes, I do think these are a bit ridiculous. Adding Alacrity to Consume Plasma means basically nothing because, well, Thieves don't have cooldowns, because weapon skills only are on the initiative system. So the only thing that Alacrity even matters for is their utility skills. And even then, most of the utility skills are on short cooldowns already. And the trait, Deadly Arts, I think it is, that basically every thief takes also includes an RNG reset for their utility skills. So they just don't get much value out of Alacrity. So this is basically a meaningless change there. Moving on to Warrior, they had a bunch of changes to their banners and such to improve the viability of Power Warrior, and particularly in PvE, basically to give them more group utility. These mean nothing for PvP and World v World. A few changes that do matter a lot for PvP and World v World is they did buff the damage of the Greatsword Auto Chain in all modes. While the damage bonuses for 100 Blade and Whirling Axe, which were included in the patch, are PvE only, the bonus to Brutal Strike and Greatsword Strike, which are part of the auto chain, is in PvP. So Greatsword Warriors will hit harder with their auto chain. And given that Greatsword Warrior already had one of the hardest hitting auto chains in the game, that's something you're going to have to watch out for. A few other changes. Winds of Disenchantment, that is the Spellbreaker Elite skill, has a longer internal cooldown between pulses. Previously it would pulse boon removal every half second, now it pulses every 1 second. Doesn't matter much for PvP. World v World will love this change though, because Winds of Disenchantment is one of the biggest meta-defining skills in World v World right now. There was a change to Burst Mastery that is live in PvP, which is the trait will now grant swiftness when landing a burst skill in addition to its previous effects. This is a skill commonly taken on most builds, which means warriors basically got a bunch of free swiftness access, which is very annoying. And that basically sums up all of the PvP related changes for warrior. And that sums up all of the changes. What does this mean altogether? Well, largely the meta is not going to change much. Scourge is still going to be meta, probably, but weaker. Firebrand is still going to be meta. Spellbreaker is definitely going to be meta. Thief will still be running Sword Dagger. The only big change is Mirage, but again, everything except Spellbreaker and Druid got cut down a bit, so there is a less of a performance gap between the worst classes in the meta and the best classes in the meta. And I definitely noticed that when playing around on my Reaper today. So there is some progress. It is not as radical as I would have liked, but I can live with it. The game is a lot playable now, a lot more playable, I should say. And I might get back into ranked, particularly since there are a lot less Scourges in the queue now. Hopefully we won't be seeing those triple to quadruple Scourge stacks anymore. So this patch was definitely a step in the right direction. And with that, that sums up basically everything I want to say, so I'll end here.